over to you, Carol.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's event, or this afternoon's event for those of our members listening to us in the States. I have Dr. Nick Barrett and Ian Cope with me, and I just want to do a brief intro for this evening. A number of people, guests, and those who've not joined one of our events before. So just a brief recap that the Stations Company is a City of London livery company, very close to the content and communication trades, industries and professions. Unique because every member of our 1,000 members has to have a connection. And I suppose that fast changing content, communication, digital world links us right back 600 centuries to when we started with quills and paper, right up to the present day. And in fact, the theme for this evening mirrors that. We're going to be looking at the Census 2021 and its history. Ian is in an unrivaled position to explain and talk us through that. And then we will pass on to Nick, who will use the census context and background to explain a little bit about how that fits in with our social history and our family history. I'm sure you're going to have lots of questions. So please, as is usual, listen, link in the Q&A, type the questions, and I'll be keeping an eye on those so that when both our speakers have spoken, we can have a panel discussion and they can ask any questions that you might have. You'll see that tonight's event is being recorded. That's because we always have people who can't make it on the evening, and we do like to make the talk available. But given that the census touches us all, we all fill in the census, and this is census year. We're delighted to welcome our speakers. And I'm going to introduce, first of all, Ian. Ian and I had the pleasure of working together many years ago, but Ian has worked for the Office of National Statistics, who run the census, for nearly 3 decades until he moved on in 2018. Particularly relevant for us tonight is that he ran all the operational aspects of the 2011 census, including the development and testing of innovations such as question tracking and online collection. He was responsible for printing all the questionnaires and the associated data capture, and I'm sure he'll tell us a little bit about that. As Director of Population and Demography, Ian subsequently had responsibility right across the population and migration and life event statistical data. And I think for us particularly relevant was that he was Census Director for the 2021 census that ran this year for England and Wales from 2014. He has advised internationally, and he's talking to us tonight from Jersey, where he is the Chief Statistician, and he oversaw the 2021 Jersey census. So I'm going to hand over to Ian to talk, and he will shortly be sharing his screen as well so that we can watch his slides. So Ian, over to you.
Thank you. Can you see the slides? Are they up now?
Yes, they are.
Super. So the title, I don't need to say that. So I'll just crack on in terms of what I'm going to cover. So I'll cover here this evening, why do we carry out census, some lessons from history, changes in the methods and innovations over time, some logistics for the 2011 and 2021 census to give you an idea of the scale and the challenges involved, a bit on sort of consultation and topics, how we decide on new questions, and then I'll wrap up with the 2021 census and how it went. So why do we conduct a census? I'll probably be talking for about 25 minutes. Why do we conduct a census? So it's a count, it's an estimate of the whole population, every city, town, village and street. And critically, it collects information on 3 main kind of characteristics: the total population, obviously, information on families, you can have more than one family in a household, and then the characteristics of the individuals within a family or a household, so their educational attainment, ethnicity, etc. It's compulsory to get high response rates. And it answers questions such as, how many of us are there? Who are we? You know, what's our education? education state, labour market status, are we employed or unemployed, what's our ethnicity, etc. And then where do we live? In the housing that we live in, the number of rooms, the availability of facilities, etc. So again, why do we conduct the census and how is it used? So it underpins national policy making, things like equalities, monetary equalities legislation, and the place of ethnic minorities and minorities within the community. It provides the foundation for the annual population estimates. We take the census, we add on births, deaths, and then estimates of inward and outward migration. It uniquely provides information for small areas down to an output area of 125 households and maybe 250 people, and for small population groups. It's used by central government, by local government, by businesses and charities for planning investment, service delivery, etc. Retailers, Sainsbury's, Tesco's, etc. will use census data to work out where to place new stores based on the demographic characteristics of the local area. And it's also used to allocate money to local areas, from central government to local authorities, NHS trusts, etc., based on the characteristics of the people in the area. So some information on the history. So the first census, and I'll talk about Thomas Malthus. So the population in the UK grew quite substantially in the late 1700s. And Thomas Malthus, in his essay on the principles of population, basically said that the population had the capacity to grow exponentially, so maybe doubling or whatever every year, 2 years, 3 years, but the ability to feed the population would only grow linearly, so that there was a significant risk of not being able to feed people. So at a time when the Napoleonic Wars, so there was an interest in the potential size of an army, there was increasing population, there was concern about the number of poor people and the ability to feed them. Parliament passed the legislation that led to the first census in 1801. And the first censuses were interviewer based. So the censuses between 1801 and 1831 were carried out by local poor law officials, and it only collected headcount information, just the total number of people. The 1841 census was the first to be self-enumeration, where the householder filled it in themselves, even though there were low levels of literacy at the time. And nowadays, the kind of traditional censuses in all countries with good literacy are self-completion. It's either on paper or online. And just a bit of history. So obviously the first census in 1801, that collected total about 8.9 million people in England and Wales. The 1920 Census Act enabled the 1921 census to be the first census that was mandatory, and we still rely on the 1920 Census Act as the basis for carrying out censuses even now. There was no census during the Second World War, but there was an enumeration in 1939 to form the basis for the registration system. Skipping ahead, the 2011 census was the first to be online. And 2021 census was the first, was kind of online first census. There's always been kind of innovation and automation through the census. So this is a photo of machinists at work on the 1921 census, kind of capturing the results onto, I think, I'm not quite sure what they were doing there, but they were obviously capturing data. And this slide gives information on kind of recent innovations in the census. So the 2001 census, we did hand delivery, as had been done traditionally, but for the first time, people could post back their questionnaires rather than having them hand collected. 2011, where I was the Director of Operations, we developed an address register, and we posted out all of the census questionnaires, which enabled us to reallocate where we put staff. We could focus on the areas where we needed them for response. And we also introduced the online return for the first time, and we achieved an online response rate of 17%. We posted out questionnaires to every household though. And the 2021 census was an online first census, so most households only got a letter with an online access code. I'll cover more about that later. So moving on to the 2021 census, this diagram kind of walks you through the process. So it starts with a questionnaire design. We have to design the questionnaire and the content, printed the questionnaire, so there were 30 million questionnaires printed. It was a vast number, I can assure you. We developed an address register for all households and communal establishments in England and Wales. And I should say that ONS is responsible for the census in England and Wales, so this is all about England and Wales, but similar processes took place in Northern Ireland and Scotland. We had a database that listed all of the addresses. The questionnaires were personalised, so they were addressed, and there was a unique internet access code added and a unique barcode. Advertising took place from about mid-February, and Census Day in 2011 was the 27th of March. The questionnaires were delivered by Royal Mail over about a 10 to 14 day period, so 26 million questionnaires delivered over a short period. Households, if they wanted help, could get it online, or they could phone up a contact centre and get help and advice. And if they needed support, they needed a replacement questionnaire, or they wanted a large print questionnaire or a braille version, they could get that. That was sent out from the fulfilment centre, and they could request that either online or through the contact centre. Households could fill the census in online, and that came through to web servers. And so when we got an online response, we could tick off on the questionnaire tracking system that we'd had a response, so we didn't need to do anything further with those responses. Or they could post them back. The majority of people did that, so they'd come back through Royal Mail. Those printed questionnaires were scanned by Royal Mail through the unique access codes through the postal system. So again, we knew quite quickly within the day which questionnaires were on their way back to us even before they'd arrived. And those questionnaires all went into a warehouse. But again, we ticked off those questionnaires on the questionnaire tracking system. So that meant we knew what we'd had in, we knew what was still outstanding, and we could direct the 35,000 field staff to follow up households that hadn't responded. Paper questionnaires were scanned and the data was captured. It was coded for occupation, industry, etc. It was transferred across to the ONS. Well, that's a kind of simple overview of the census. Of course, it's much more complicated than that in practice. So this gives you an idea of some of the kind of quantities involved with the census. So, as I said, 26 million households. And in addition to that, we posted out 26 million house questionnaires. About 750,000 additional questionnaires were requested. So where people had either not received one, or they'd lost them, or the dog had chewed them, or whatever. 5,000 large print questionnaires were issued. And in terms of recruitment, we had 35,000 field staff. That meant about 300,000 applications were processed. 65,000 conditional offers were made. Of course, not everybody is going to accept the offer. 3,000 classroom training events. There were translation leaflets available in about 54 different languages. Polish was by far the most popular. About 5,000 of those were downloaded. We handled 250,000 timesheets, and then about 7,000 community events were organised across England and Wales, where people could come along and get support to fill out their census. This graph shows the profile of the returns. So obviously people started to fill out the census early. And in fact, we got our first online response within 40 minutes of it going live. by census day, we'd had about 30% of the returns. And then when follow-up started, 10 days after the census on the 6th of April, we'd had 78% of returns by that point. And the 35,000 field staff were necessary to get from 78% to 94%, which was our target. And that's where we spent about £70 million on those staff over that period. So it's about, taking into account the contracts, about a quarter of the census spend is in that process to get from 78% to 94%. As part of that process, we sent out reminder letters to addresses that hadn't responded. So we sent nearly 4 million reminder letters. I'm not going to go through the detail, but you can kind of see how we sent those out, targeted at various points. And then the last couple of days, we sent out 800,000 letters a day. And this was quite important. It got us an extra 4% response from memory. And it wasn't something we'd initially planned, but actually turned out to be quite effective. Sometimes enumerators can struggle to get access to a property if it's an access controlled, a block of flats where you need to put an access code in. The follow-up staff can find it quite difficult to get into those, whereas obviously the Royal Mail are used to delivering to all those addresses. This chart shows caused requests made, and it's so a peak, which is just after the census day, and reminder 27th of March was census day. So just over 20,000 requests were handled by the interactive voice recognition system. So that was kind of automated. You'd phone up, you get dial 1 for this and dial 2 for that, and you could get advice that way. About 115,000 queries were dealt with online at that peak, and there were nearly 60,000 calls to the helpline that were handled by advisors in the contact centre at peak, just after census day. So at peak, that was nearly 200,000 queries were addressed within a 1 or 2 day period, with about 600 staff at peak. So moving on to the 2021 census. This kind of shows you the timeline. So you can see that 2021 census work started in 2012 and it will finish in 2023. So each census, although the census happens every 10 years, each census is an 11 or 12-year program. So the early part was looking at options. How should we run the 2021 census? Should we even run a census at all? Because the legislation allows for a census, but unlike some other countries, doesn't actually require a census. And then, how are we going to run it, and what were the approaches going to be taken? So lots of research, lots of engagement. In early 2014, the National Statistician made a recommendation, and I'll come to that in the next slide. We did consultation around topics. What questions should be asked in the 2021 census? Which ones should we drop? Which new topics to add? And I'll cover more about that later. We did some small-scale testing, and then we ran a large-scale test in 2017, and I'll cover that later on. That was about 200,000 households. A white paper, so that's the government's plans for the census, was published in 2018. And a rehearsal in 2019, autumn 2019, and that was about 100,000 households. As I said, the census legislation enables but doesn't require a census. So to require the census, each census has some secondary legislation, and that's a census order which sets out the particulars to be covered, and then the regulations which cover the detailed arrangements for the census in England and Wales. Census day in 2021 was the 21st of March, followed shortly thereafter by the Census Coverage survey, and then the ONS is working now towards the publication of the first outputs next spring. And then you'll be into the next process with a 2023 kind of review and a recommendation for the 2031 census. So it starts all over again. So it's a ongoing. It's the gift that keeps on giving. So as I said, the National Statistician's recommendation in March 2014 was for an online census for all households and communal establishments, but also support for those who were not able to complete the census online. But also, alongside that, increased use of administrative data and surveys to enhance those statistics, to make the best use of all available data as a springboard for the future. And that kind of plays into potential considerations for the 2031 census. This is a sort of operational map for the 2021 census. Although it looks different, it's broadly the same as the process for 2011 that I outlined. But the thing that's different is that each household will be sent, it was sent either a unique access code. Most households, about 75% of households, were just sent a letter with an access code, or they could be sent a paper questionnaire or an individual questionnaire in areas where we knew there was poor online access, for instance. But otherwise, you know, the contact centre, telephone capture, online help, communications campaign, those were all very similar as in 2011. Now I'll talk about the sort of scale of the census, so just to give you an idea of the scale of the 2021 census. I've said 26 million households and communal establishments. So a communal establishment is managed accommodation where people normally live. So that will include things like old people's care homes, army bases, hospitals where people are there for a long period of time, university halls of residence, those kind of things. An estimated 60 million people, again a field force of around 35,000, estimated 30 million unique access codes printed and sent out, translations available in 56 different languages. And we estimated that at peak on census day, would be the peak day, there might be nearly 8 million people completing the census online. And that compares to about 1 million people for the HMRC's self-assessment peak on the 31st of January each year. So it just kind of puts it into context. 6.5 million paper forms were sent. Difficult to know how many people would want a paper form. So that covers both the 25% that was estimated where we'd post out from the get-go, and spares for people that wanted them, that had been sent a unique access code but actually wanted to fill it out on paper. An estimated 1 million calls to the help desk, about 600 staff, and based on the 2011 census, an estimated 8 billion sales of data sales of information published after the census. And then target was set of 94% response rate, and of which 75% online. And just if you recall, that compares to 17% online achieved in 2011. And the next slide will kind of talk to why that matters. So this is about the cost of a response. So an online response without any follow-up activity costs about £3, about £4. A paper questionnaire without any follow-up activities, just over £10. Once you have people starting to knock on doors, the cost increased rapidly, just over £23 for online and nearly £30 for paper. So you can see quite clearly why it's important to drive up the online response rate and to do so to make it easy for people to fill online without the need for follow-up. So the kind of channel mix is really critical to delivering value for money, and the need to sort of target self-response and to make that really easy. And changing tack, and moving on to the topic consultation. The ONS ran a consultation on the information needs from the census between June and August in 2015. So we set out an initial document setting out our understanding of the user needs, questions we might drop, and things that we knew about. So in 2011, we asked both the number of rooms and the number of bedrooms, and we proposed dropping the number of rooms for 2021. We thought we could get that data from admin sources. Requests came in for volunteering, which we didn't take forward. And then, as in 2011, there was a request for questions on sexual orientation. And what was new in 2021 was requests for information on gender identity and also on the armed force community. There were 1,100 responses to the consultation, nearly 300 from organisations, mostly local authorities, and about 800 responses from individuals. So sexual orientation and gender identity, there was a clear user need for this. It relates to the 2010 Equalities Act and Equalities Monitoring. We developed a question on sexual orientation and tested that in the 2017 test, carried out public attitudes research, and we engaged with various interested groups, including Stonewall, and groups that represented those with a non-binary, with a non-standard kind of gender identity, partly to understand the user needs and partly to kind of clarify the concepts to measure. We decided to go ahead with both of these, and we made it clear that these would be voluntary, so that required changes to primary legislation. The armed forces community, the need there flowed from the Armed Forces Covenant that had been passed into law in 2010, and the NHS and local authorities said that if they were to target their services and to meet the needs of the armed forces in their areas, they needed to know how many there were. We set up a working group with the MOD to understand the user requirement, to look at the, what data was held. So MOD had electronic data going back to 1971, but that didn't fully capture all of those that might have left the services before then. We looked at some data that was in the annual population survey, developed a question, and this was asked in 2021 for the first time. And obviously there was engagement with people like the Royal British Legion, and then people that wanted this data, including the NHS and local government. This diagram shows some of the complexity of running the census. So we had a kind of matrix management organisation within the ONS. So that circle is all within the ONS, and it shows the kind of things that you have to develop. So statistical methods were developed by our methodology team, branding, marketing were done. We had a Census Comms team, and we worked with the ONS Comms and the Government Communication Service. We had topic leads, topic experts around the office. The address register was developed by our geography division. Legislation was dealt with by parliamentary unit. Procurement, contracts, all that kind of stuff was led by our commercial services. In-house IT team built all of the systems, including the online system. In 2011, that had been outsourced. Finance supported around budget management, etc. Security was dealt with by our facilities management and the IT people, and we had our project management office support of project management, etc. So even you can see that it's really complicated, either both within and externally to the ONS. This kind of shows something about the testing program. We had a 2017 test that I talked about, 200,000 households. The rehearsal in autumn 2019, 100,000 households, and then obviously the main event in 2021, 26 million households. This diagram shows the areas that we included in the 2017 test, and these were dotted around the country to represent a mix of hard to count areas. If we chose deliberately hard areas. If you can make it work in hard areas, then it gives you confidence that it'll work in the census itself. So it was a mixture of inner city London, rural areas with poor internet connection, areas with a large ethnic minority community, areas that were hard to count, rural, etc. So you can see there Blackpool's, Somerset, Dorset, Powers in Wales, Blackpool. So, and also the census office is down between Portsmouth and Southampton. So it's quite important actually to have test areas that aren't too close, because otherwise you can lull yourself into a false sense of community, of security. So how did the census go in 2021? Census Day was on the 21st of March. And if you recall, England and Wales were still in lockdown then, which I think was probably beneficial to what I'm going to show you in a minute. There was good publicity, obviously much greater use of social media in 2021 than had been in the case in 2011. So people were sent out a letter with their unique access code or paper questionnaire. There was a whole load of buildings were coloured purple, lit up purple on Census Day. So included Blackpool Tower and iconic buildings in London. This is Belfast City Hall. And that got a lot of local media coverage, which was positive. People were encouraged to complete the census online. And this diagram is actually communications and marketing for the census in Jersey. We worked with the ONS and were able to use a very similar marketing material, but obviously with Jersey specific images. And the census in Jersey, by comparison, is only about 100,000, 110,000 people, 50,000 households, so it's half the size of one of the tests or rehearsals. So the response rates, a target of 94%, but actually achieved 97%, which is an amazing response rate. And I'm sure that was partly helped by the lockdown. Young people and young men in particular are difficult to enumerate in the census. They lead busy lives. Of course, during lockdown, they had fewer distractions. And compared to the target of 75% online, ONS actually achieved 89%. Countries that run a 5-yearly census, like New Zealand, Australia, and Canada, had achieved response rates of around 60-65% in 2016. But 89% is a really excellent response. So ONS are working on processing the census results now, and are aiming to publish in spring, first results in spring next year. And then my final 3 slides are just kind of give an overview of innovations. So the top row shows the kind of questions that have been added to each census since 1991. So ethnic group, long-term illness, carers and religion were added in 2001, national identity and language were added in 2011, gender identity, sexual orientation and veterans were added in 2021. Data collection, I've talked about some of those, the introduction of, in 2011, for instance, of the address register, post out, post back, and online first in 2021. And you can see how some of those innovations have enabled us to reduce the number of field staff from 111,000 in 1981 to 35,000 in 2021, whilst maintaining and improving the overall response rate. The top row here shows the kind of enumeration coverage survey. So up till 1991, we had a very small post-enumeration survey. I haven't covered this, but we introduced the Census Coverage survey from 2021, which enables us to estimate households that are missing and to kind of fill in the gaps. Response rates, you can see very high response rates in 81 and 91, but since 2001, it's got more challenging, and we've achieved response rates of 94 and up to 97 again. Then processing, 1981 was the first time we used imputation to fill in the gaps for non-responses. From 2001, we've had coverage adjustment. And from 2021, admin data will be used to help fill in the gaps as well. And then my final slide is about outputs and geography. So up till 1991, the output areas were the enumeration districts, so the areas that were designed for enumerating. In 2021, we introduced output areas, which were small and were designed to be stable over time. In 2011, the outputs were made available online for the first time. And then that final row there, which is my final substantive point, you can see how the population of England and Wales has actually changed over that period from about 50 million in 1981 to estimated over 60 million in 2021. So that's it for me. I'm going to stop sharing now and hand over back to Carol.
Thank you very much, Ian. Who knew that it's sort of a major project extraordinaire, how much effort and testing goes into it. So I think you've unlocked that secret, and I hope that gives you some great context to everybody who's listening tonight. And so now I'm going to hand over to Nick, Dr. Nick Barrett, who I've also worked with. I've got lots of pleasure with in introducing my speakers tonight. Nick is an author, broadcaster, and historian, and very topically for us, very connected through his work on the BBC's Who Do You Think You Are, with the new series that started about 3 weeks ago, and I know many people are really glued to that. He's a director of learner and discovery services at the Open University and has played a number of roles in a number of institutions in that area. He's a fellow of the University of Dundee, a fellow of the Royal Historical Society, writes widely. His latest publication explores the reigns of Henry II, Richard I, and John, called The Restless Kings. And importantly for us tonight, he has been the president of the Family History Federation. I think he's just stood down from that role, and sits on the executive committee of the Community Archives and Heritage Group. So over to you, Nick, to bring this a little bit to life for us as to how we can really explore and delve behind the data.
Thanks, Carol. I mean, what a fantastic exploration and explanation of the census over all of those centuries. As you've said, it's an extraordinary operation. I want to just take a slightly different approach and look at the human stories that sit behind them. And the work that Ian has shown about the value of the census to governments and a range of other organisations is well known about, and of course is bang up to date. But in my field, when a new census set is released, we're talking about the detailed information about individuals in each of those households, rather than some of the statistical reports that are produced within years of the census being taken. Now, these records are closed for 100 years for good reason, because as we've seen, people are filling in very detailed questions about their lives. And that 100-year closure gives them a sense of anonymity and therefore honesty. But we use it as historians in a range of different ways, which really transcend the value from statistical planning into something rather magical. I mean, my goodness, as a medieval historian, we'd love to have had censuses all those centuries ago. And it is a very 18th, 19th century phenomenon which gained traction as society changed and created new drivers for continuing to count the population and ask more questions about what was going on. So the detailed census returns that are released every 100 years, after 100 years, gives us that window into what society was like. Genealogists and family historians get very excited once every 10 years because a new data set is released. And our date marked in red in the calendar is the 6th of January 2022, when the 1921 census is released. And we use these records heavily for research into social history, socioeconomic history, house history, family history, and of course the work that supports TV programs like Who Do You Think You Are? And I just want to explore that in a bit of detail, because the value that Ian's described is very much around benefits to all of us, governmental planning, resource, etc. But there's also a really important value in the work that genealogists do as well. And if anyone's seen an episode of Who Do You Think You Are, you'll probably be struck by the emotional journey that individuals go on, but that sense of understanding and connection they make, not just with their ancestors, but the communities in which they live their lives, the social and national, international events that change the course of their life. And we can only tell these stories of individuals through the census and a range of other genealogical records. But for me, the census return is the richest source of information about individuals because it's structured, contextual information. Now, as Ian mentioned, the early headcounts were interview-based and were little more than statistical exercises, but there were wonderful people going around with their notebooks, asking questions, but also taking down a few other notes as well. I'm particularly struck by a chap called Richard Stouffer, who was a census enumerator for Saxmundham in 1831. And not only did he provide all of the statistical data as required, he also wrote down in his notebooks who was living with whom, who had slept with whom, who had fathered which children, really great tittle-tattle about the local area. And maybe perhaps less because of the salacious details, but more because of the connectivity there was a big drive from 31 to 41 to add more detail in. I've got some slides, very, very short number of slides, just to show you how the census changed over time and the various uses we can explore that tell us more about our personal heritage and the connection we have today with many of the communities, and understand some of those long trends that play out over time. But I also want to explore some of the social history that lies behind the census as well, because we talk about family history and connectivity, but the census changed over time and tells us an awful lot about what sort of factors mattered. One of the great bugbears many historians have with the census returns is that they were very hierarchical and patriarchal. So regardless of the status of the family, the head was usually the eldest male. And in this case, I think the absurdity of that is laid bare, because this was the 1851 census return for Buckingham Palace. Now, the head of the household was Prince Albert. His wife was the Queen. So she clearly outranks him, but not in her own household. But a really interesting insight there into the connectivity that we've got. We have a snapshot of who the people are, their titles in this case, their jobs. Her occupation was being the Queen. I mean, stands to reason, doesn't it? Their age and the relationship of everybody to the head of the household. So Prince Albert being the head, the relationship with Queen Victoria was his wife, and of course there were the children. And you also find recorded at Buckingham Palace all the servants and where they were born and where they came from. So it's a lovely snapshot into some of those family dynamics about what matters and what doesn't matter. I want to jump ahead a little bit to 1881 because, as I said, it covers all walks of life, and there are stories within stories, because this tells you about how areas changed over time. You can skip back 10 years to 1871 and 1861, and you find this part of Spitalfield has very little evidence of mass migration. But by 1881, you're starting to see settlers from parts of the former Russian Empire fleeing some of the early pogroms, the persecution of Jewish communities, and they started to move across. But this is a little bit interesting because it's slightly earlier. This is 1881. And they'd moved across because there was a burgeoning fashion industry based around some of the Spitalfield weavers who'd been there since the 18th century, hence calling this area Fashion Street. And you've got some very interesting names appearing here: Schneider, Weinberg, Abraham, and Sagar right at the bottom. And you can track families through time. And if you track Solomon Sagar through time, you see that as the wave of migration increases, there's an attempt from some of these early settlers to change their name, and he becomes Solomon Sugar, and his great grandson is Alan Sugar. So you can spot the progenitors of famous celebrities today. Sadly, we haven't done Alan Sugar on Who Do You Think You Are, and I've probably blown all the state secrets here. The other thing to look at here is not just the occupation and place of birth, but some of the house status as well. Here we have houses close together, and you can start to compare the census with other data sets such as the Charles Booth poverty maps, and you can get a sense of how crowded the houses were, how the area changed. So again, this is lifting the lid on family, social, local and house history, as well as some of the national and international factors that played through. By the time you get to 1911, the records that have been released are the individual records returned by the householders themselves. So for the first time, you get a sense of your ancestors' handwriting. And here's a lovely example where you get a sense not just of what people were doing, but their personality, their political beliefs, their ideology. And it's clear that when the census enumerators delivered the returns to be filled in, the parents were out. But the rather feisty daughter, Mary Harvey here, decided to fill it in on their behalf. And it's very clear what she thought, that she was an artist and a suffragette, and her views are writ large across the form. This was a political statement. This was an act of rebellion. And you can see it's an act of rebellion because the enumerator, when he got hold of it, looked at what she's put in the disability column. Her disability, her infirmity, was being not enfranchised. She was disabled because she could not cast a vote in the way that menfolk could. And the census enumerator, rather sniffily put a red line through it. So I just thought I'd share those as a few examples about how we can use census returns today. Yes, they are fantastic resources to allow us to look at statistical planning and derive value at that top level. But they're also this incredible window into the way we used to live our lives. And it's a different sort of value. It's a non-financial value to people who are making these connections. And there's a greater emphasis on personal heritage and community support that we're going to see play out over the next few years in the post-pandemic decade. And the thread that we're linking through here is how societies were affected by a previous pandemic. When we look at 1921, for example, we're going to see the effects of the First World War, but also the effects of the Spanish flu, which of course raged 1918, 19 and into 1920. So it's a very interesting parallel between what we've just lived through and are still living through today and how society dealt with that through the 1921 census. So don't let anyone persuade you that this is self-indulgent navel-gazing to do family history or somehow irrelevant. You can learn the lessons of history, but you learn those lessons best of all when they are personal and they're connected to you. So hopefully that provides a little bit of context to some of Ian's conversation. And Carol, back to you. Hopefully that will generate some questions.
I hope so too. Thanks, Nick. It's fascinating, isn't it, that I watched the episode of Who Do You Think You Are last week. It was Alex Scott, the footballer pundit, and she was handed in the course of this story, her personal story, at one stage a copy of a census entry and also a copy of the 1939 register entry as well. But nobody explained them, and they just sort of, miraculously materialized. But a lot of hard work goes into that research, doesn't it, to actually delve behind the actual data.
Yeah, don't get me started on that. Because since the show first came out in 2004, there's long been this debate about whether more process needs to be put in. And actually, the only reason I'm associated with the show even today, bearing in mind I don't really work on it anymore, was because after series 1, we had 10 minutes at the end of each episode, myself and Adrian Childs, exploring the sources and unpacking what we've just seen. So it was the research behind the headlines. And today, I'm an archivist at heart, I'm a historian at heart. The documents are a device to trigger a conversation, they're props. And you're right, Carol, the teams that work on this work so hard, not just to connect the genealogy together and stand up the personal connections, but to stand up the stories. And the census is the gateway to other data sets and other records. You cannot do it without looking at that census return and getting a sense of where someone lived, what they were doing, how the family's fortunes changed over decades. It's that sequential basis that makes it such a rich resource for historians.
Yeah. And you mentioned about the 1921 census being released, just recently announced, being released in January next year, which will be fascinating. And I just wondered, for genealogical research, what effect is it going to be? Because that, as it happens, that 1921 census is the last official census until 1951, because, as I understand it, a fire in 1942, war fire, burnt down the building on the docks where the 1931 census was being held. The 1941 census was cancelled. So we've got this enormous gap. What effect is that going to have on family research, that we've got this sort of lacuna for 30 years?
It is pretty challenging. We do have the 1939 register, which is a census substitute. It's linked to the war effort, trying to make sure that people were registered for a variety of purposes that was used over time. That's been released, so we've got that out already. But this is where you get that rupture in the sequential search, and it's going to be a major challenge, coupled with the era of GDPR and access to personal records, the right to be forgotten. We're entering into a very different conversation between the records that we've got, the ability to access them, and the desire to undertake this sort of historical research. Of course, we might wring our hands about the gap between 21 and 51 in England, Wales, Scotland, but let's not forget that in Ireland it's an even bigger picture, because for them, they've been working without census returns pretty much up to 1901, because all of their census returns were destroyed during the Civil War. During the conflict, the archives were bombed and destroyed, and they all went up in flames. So this isn't new and unique to us, but it is going to be a bit of a problem. We are going to have to find other ways to bridge those gaps.
Yeah. And Ian, how difficult is it to decide on what questions to include? Because presumably for it to be a statistical service, you've got to have some core connection, haven't you, going through the thread of the history of all the different censuses. So throwing in a question could actually affect the statistical value of the data.
So, a good question, Carol. So for each census, you've always got this tension between maintaining trends over time, because one of the things that the census enables you to do is look at long-term trends, the educational status of individuals, ethnicity, we've been asking since 91, etc. So you always want to maintain those long-term trends whilst also being relevant to today. So, in the 50s, we used to ask about idiots. Well, obviously, that's totally inappropriate now. Whereas with the move towards the equalities monitoring, if you look at the protected characteristics, you want to ask about disability, which we ask, sexual orientation, which we now ask, sex, etc., long-term unremitting illness. So you always got that tension between maintaining trends and keeping questions in whilst also being relevant, and at the same time without making the census questionnaire too long so that people give up and don't fill it in. So that's why that kind of consultation process is really important. We set out really clear criteria on what would be a kind of test that you would have to apply. So, if the information is available from an alternative source, then it shouldn't be asked in the census. It needs to be available either for small population groups or for small areas. So all of the 3 questions that were added in 2021 met that test. The gender identity, there's poor information on that, but the best estimate suggests that it's about 0.25% of the population have a gender identity that's not the same as the sex that they were born in. Well, the census is the only way that you're ever going to measure that. Likewise, sexual orientation and the armed forces, there isn't alternative sources. So there's quite a high bar to get into the census. And then we do lots of work with developing questions. We test them to make sure that they're acceptable to the public. If you have a question that will turn people off, there's a real danger that they stop at that point and don't ask any further questions. So that's why the consultation for the 2021 census started 6 years ago, because you have to do all that kind of testing, research, and engagement with the user community. This time round, we had to have changes to primary legislation to make those 2 new questions optional. All that stuff takes time.
Yeah, and of course the press always pick up on the meteor or the slightly interesting one, wasn't it? Was it the 2011 census that had the religion question in, and everybody was Jedi warriors or something like that?
Religion was first asked in 2001, but what had happened in 2006 census in New Zealand, there'd been this campaign to record yourself as a Jedi that flowed through to 2011. I think we had about 350,000 Jedis in 2011. We didn't output that. I remember the Metro had a headline in about 2008 about the census that said, what's your pay and are you gay? And neither of those were questions that we actually intended to ask in the census. We didn't ask a question about income. We didn't ask a question about sexual orientation. So the media, aren't always constrained by the reality.
Yeah, and somebody's asked a question about how many fines were issued for non-completion of the 2011 census. Is there any actual rigor behind that?
Yeah, there's a whole non-compliance process. So to be able to, under the Census Act, you can be fined up to £1,000 for non-completion of the census. It has to go to a magistrate's court. But under the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, PACE, to be able to proceed that way, you have to give somebody an interview under caution, and you need a name for that. So if we haven't had a response from an address but don't know the name, we can't actually proceed any further. So what actually happened is we started the process against about 16,000 households, sending out fairly strongly worded letters, and through the various steps, about half of the each step, about half of those households actually fill in the questionnaire. In terms of the actual fines, I think it was about 300 people that actually went to the magistrates' courts and were fined. We would actually accept, and we did accept, completed questionnaires on the magistrates' steps, court steps. We don't want to fine people, but it's necessary to show that that threat is valid for the future censuses.
Yes. Well, it looks as if that's not going to be much needed, given the response rates for this year's census. They seem quite phenomenal, really, for all that. Yeah.
Next time around, we need another lockdown in 2031.
Yeah. Well, it was a highlight. It was something to do that day, wasn't it? Really, when we were all racing around for things to do. Someone said, had they misremembered that this year was going to be the last census? What's your view on that, Ian?
So, if you recall on the timeline, I said that in 2023 there will be a process to review the proposals for 2031. So the National Statistician's recommendations in 2014 talked about an online census and developing the use of administrative data. So the ONS has done really good work putting together data that's already held within the government, and they can produce really good estimates of the population actually without doing a census. But there are some questions like ethnicity, for instance, and sexual orientation that aren't well captured in admin sources. So when you register for a benefit or collect tax or register with your GP, you probably don't tell them your sexual orientation. So those kind of information, you either need a census or you have to collect that data from a survey. So my guess is there will either be a recommendation that says we don't need a census in 2031, and many countries in the world don't carry out a traditional census in the way that we do. They use data that's held by government. Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland have been doing this since the 60s and 70s, the Netherlands as well. So they mostly use data that's held in government, maybe supplemented by a survey. So my guess is it will either be a recommendation that we move to that model, or that we do carry out a census in 2031 that has many fewer questions because we can fill in the gaps by data that's already held by government. What was a game changer was the Digital Economy Act in 2017 that gave the ONS the right to access data that's already held in government. Prior to that, it was a very difficult and laborious process to get access to any data. We wanted some data from DWP, and it took over 2 years to get access to it. The Digital Economy Act has kind of streamlined that process, and made it much easier to get access for statistical research purposes.
So, Nick, if there wasn't to be a census in 2031 as we recognise it, what issues is that going to cause for the family historian in a century's time?
It's a very difficult question to answer because we're already seeing some of the challenges in.
You've lost your sound, Ian. Nick, sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I think it's going to really challenge our ability to track families through time. We've already got this gap that we're going to see between 21 and 51. And after that, hopefully we'll still be able to get access to this material. But as Ian said, there will be other data sets around. Whether we will have access to it is a moot point. We've relied so far on access to indexes, to birth, marriage, death records, and there's moves to close some of those indexes down, because the data has been used to create false identities, to support cybercrime. These are the sorts of ethical issues we need to think about. But from a pure genealogical perspective, yes, it will produce a gap. However, if we are going to have more consistent data, that might also help genealogists. For me, that should then be a warning sign that if we want to ensure that our stories are passed down through the generations, we possibly need to think about some new genealogical personal heritage archiving tools that we could create. So not necessarily putting all of our content on the aggregating platforms like Ancestry or Find My Past or social media, but maybe a different way of chronicling our lives and making sure they're passed down for posterity.
Yeah, and
Sorry, just to chip in, Carol, I think when the ONS is considering the options for the 2031 census, which will be, probably sooner than people think, will probably be in 2023, and I'm sure they will engage. The ONS is very good at that kind of consultation. It's quite important that kind of family historians, it won't drive the decision, but you need to make sure that the voices are heard.
I must say that there was a lot of engagement in the planning for the 21 census, and I went to a number of stakeholder meetings with other colleagues from the genealogical and local history community, and the message that we put out, that the continuity has really enriched our understanding of society, not just in the past, but threading it through to today, I think was heard. So we were very, very pleased to be involved, and would obviously be pleased to be involved in 23 whenever that takes place.
One of the things I didn't say is that the 2021 census cost about £880 million.
Wow.
So when you're thinking about that, there's a whole range of user needs that you're taking account of. Obviously government is funding this, so government needs, feature fairly importantly, but they're not the only needs. Local authorities, the NHS, businesses, charities, and family historians. So you kind of there's a real range of voices that have to be listened to.
Yeah, and I can remember from when I was at the National Archives, we issued the 1939 registers in 2015. I remember we had a big launch party at Cafe Royal, which was very unusual for us in government, but that was because I think Find My Past, wasn't it, was sponsoring it. But those registers were fascinating because you're just thinking about other administrative data that might be around that supplements or complements census data, because those registers were created in September 1939 just to give ID cards to everybody, and then it was ration books. And what I learned, which was absolutely fascinating, because I was very involved on the legal side of the registers, because they were used right up until 1991 by the NHS to track individuals. So these registers had a left-hand page and a right-hand page, and there's a lot of personal sensitive data, and so we had to find ways of redacting, of closing it down, which is really difficult. But the idea that these 1939 registers were still a core data source in 1991, I remember the deep intake of breath at the board meeting at the National Archives when we realized that, and it was a really complex process. But even then, the fact that conscription didn't start until 1940 meant that it was an important resource, because it did give you a record of even people who later went into active service, people who were still living at home, and you could track them. So that's the sort of, that was a big light bulb moment for me about how significant and important these sort of databases were. And if we don't have them in the future, that we will be the poorer. But Nick, what's the 100-year rule? Why do we only release things after 100 years?
So this is to protect individuals from any misuse of information. It's the rough rule of thumb based on the life expectancy, give or take a few years, but obviously as that starts to increase, as people are living longer, that might be looked at, and that's why many military records are closed for extended periods beyond 100 years. So it's really to give people the confidence when they're filling out the form that it's not going to be released during their lifetime, which could then embarrass them, and it would encourage them to be more honest and open with their answers. particularly, as Ian said, around some of the sensitive questions that are being asked today. So great use for future historians, but shouldn't impact upon our life expectancy. This is a perennial question that keeps coming up whenever we've just had a big census release. Is the law going to change? Are we going to get the next census earlier? Well, that's not going to happen now because we've got this big gap to 51, but maybe that will then increase the pressure to have the 100-year rule reduced. That would involve an act of parliament, of course, to change the law, and I can't see that happening. Genealogists would be quite persuasive folk, but
Nick, it's not actually set out in legislation, it's a rule of thumb. The 30-year rule for release of government records, the ONS has to apply every 10 years for an extension. So it's actually not set out in legislation, but that is government policy, it's established government policy.
I think the Freedom of Information Act also sort of reinforced that 100-year rule as the sort of average age, although as with the 1939 registers, when they were released, if you could prove that somebody had died, like you can do generally speaking, then you can get access to their data. It's really fascinating. But Ian, you mentioned that your work on the Jersey census, 110 people, like half a test area. How do you maintain the privacy of that sort of data? Because even anonymized, you can't imagine many top-level statistics emerging from that that would protect people's identity.
Particularly in Jersey, where kind of lots of people know each other.
Yeah.
So,
and are related to each other as well.
So what we do there is we suppress more than the ONS does. So the ONS, in the past, had anything that was below 3 was either rounded to 0 or 3. Now there's the more sophisticated method. In Jersey, we suppress anything less than 10. So if there's a number less than 10, we don't publish it, and that kind of helps there. And we publish less of the granularity would be the case. And also, one of the things I didn't talk about, the ONS has anonymized microdata. So for instance, there's a 10% sample of household data. We remove the names, the addresses, the identifiers, but then they're available to researchers to be able to do various kind of research. We don't offer that facility in Jersey because of that kind of identification risk.
Yeah. And somebody's asked, how is our data kept safe? Where are the censuses kept? Were all those forms or digital data kept in?
So the paper questionnaires are held in an ONS store down there, Bournemouth. So all the paper questionnaires, etc. For 2011 and for 2011, and for 2001, the records were transferred onto microfiche, and they're stored in the Titchfield offices between Portsmouth and Southampton. We worked with the National Archives to work out what was a sensible storage mechanism, because you might think, well, we should store them electronically, but you can't guarantee that whatever storage device we choose, it will still be readable in 100 years' time. Whereas microfiche, if you keep a microfiche reader, they will be. So basically the ONS holds those and is responsible for their integrity and security for that 100-year period. And then close to the release, so like the 2021 census, those, as you all know, those records are then transferred to the National Archive, who then scan them ready to make them available.
I can remember the scanning for the 1911 census, the preparations for that, when I was at the National Archives. And if we had any ministers visiting or any senior people, then we often took them into that part of the archive where all the paper records had all been brought back from wherever they were kept, so that they could, there was a fume room, and there were in the basement, and there were big printers. So every single paper form from 1911 had to be fumigated and opened out and made secure. But I do remember showing them and you just couldn't see the end of the rows. And that was when we were saying, look at the resources that we need. But I do remember that very significantly.
I mentioned that we printed 26 million households each had a paper questionnaire. So just to put into context, if you put all of those on the long shelf, it would be something like 49 miles long.
Yeah,
If you want to do the scale.
that's really well. We're getting towards the close of our evening, and I need to draw things to a close. But I just want to add a final question for both of you. If you could wave a magic wand, what one improvement would you make to, assuming we have them, but to future censuses, to future returns, and why? What's the big ask or the big improvement? Ian, what would you choose?
So, I mean, we've, over the last few years, the last 3 censuses, we've changed the model quite significantly. I mean, I think if there is a 2031 census, it will actually follow a very similar model to 2021, predominantly online. It will probably be a much higher online response rate by then. And the evidence is that you get much better quality data when people complete it online. They don't make mistakes, and you can have edit checks, etc. online. So, but also increased use of administrative data so that we can reduce the number of questions, which will make, in the US, they have a different model. They have a census that only asks 8 questions, and then they have a very large American community survey, which is asked every year on a rotating basis, that kind of fills in the gaps that would be on the individual questionnaire. So if you could fill that in with administrative data, you could actually end up with a much smaller questionnaire, maybe, I don't know, 10, 15 questions. You could probably fill in on the phone, and that would reduce the burden on people.
That's a good point. That's a good point. And Nick, what would your magic wand deliver?
It is probably impossible and implausible, but just thinking back to the research that I've enjoyed on historic censuses, the thing that's missing is the face and the voice of the individual. Wouldn't it be good if we could somehow capture the face of the person who's filled in the form and make it much more of a biographical record that future generations might want to then look back on and have the image and possibly even a few words of the individual where they could make a statement? That's where the magic of family history comes to life when we move into the digital age. We've got social media and all of these platforms awash with personal digital content, which is unsecured and at risk. Actually having an official census that could somehow tether and tie some of that together would be a brilliant resource for future historians. But I'm aware that there are a whole range of ethical and storage challenges around trying to do that. Yeah.
Well, I suppose the TV programs try and do that in a sort of exemplar, don't they? And then keep us all interested. Although I did hear on the radio something completely different the other day, that if you go back to 1600, we just looked at the numbers, weren't we? The differences between, say, the 1911 census, and I think, there were then something like 36 million names. Now, I think Ian said 60 million for the 2011 one. But I think in 1600s, 1 in 200 people were descended from royalty, just because of the population size. So that's, if anybody watched the Josh Widdicombe and his connections to Edward I a couple of weeks ago, perhaps more than we realise do have those royal links. But anyway, I need to thank both Nick and Ian for their time and their expertise and literally bringing the census to life for us. So many questions that we could ask, but anyway, thank you so much for joining us. For members, our next event is on December the 2nd, and so do join us for some festive fare. We're talking about cards, crackers, and a stationer's Christmas. And we've mentioned the National Archives, wonderful institution that it is, a few times tonight, as well as the Office of National Statistics. But the National Archives senior researcher, our own archivist Ruth, and the Chief Executive of the Greetings Cards Association, Amanda Ferguson, are going to give us an update on this Victorian Christmas and how it is told through our own stationers' records, which I think will be a great one to have with a glass of eggnog or whatever suitable. So do join us, and if you've enjoyed tonight, members, do consider a donation to our hall charity. These events are always free, and we're really grateful, and we hope to offer some hospitality to Nick and Ian when our hall opens again next year. And if anybody who's listening isn't a member and is interested, then you can go to our website and look us up there. But you've been wonderful audience tonight. You've been very quiet, but you've asked some interesting questions. So thank you again, Nick and Ian, on behalf of all of us. And good night, everybody. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.